just introduce, I mean, it's very almost redundant to introduce Thomas Pogge in this conference, but nevertheless, for propriety's sake, let me say that Thomas is the instigator, initiator, the living breath behind the series of academic stand against poverty conferences that we've been having on global justice for several years now. This goes with what Eva was saying a moment ago. Thomas is a philosopher. I would say he's probably considered the greatest interpreter of John Rawls, if not his greatest student. But I think Thomas is a scholar in his own right. I use everything you write, Thomas, on human rights and political thought. The amazing thing is how Thomas makes philosophy work. And here I do mean marching with our feet and doing things with our hands, and of course with the money. Thomas has taken the tools and concepts of philosophy, especially ethics, to establish academic stand against poverty, the Health Impact Fund, all the work on illicit financial flows. These are all projects that come immediately to mind. And I think we'll hear in a moment about the SDGs. This is something Thomas, I think you were talking about what would they call the first bunch, the MDGs? That was before the SDGs came around. So I am still teaching about the MDGs, and you've already, of course, written about the SDGs, those highly touted sustainable development goals of the UN. And Thomas is going to speak to us about poverty under the banner of the SDGs. I love that word, banner. So thank you, Thomas, so much for talking with us today.
Good. Thank you, Anat. And basically, poverty is something that for several generations, we have been in a position to eradicate completely from this earth. And we have been aware of that. There's been a lot of rhetoric back about 100 years or so, saying that this generation is the one that can eradicate poverty. We have it in our power. Let's do it. And of course, we haven't done it. And we have done it, or we have attempted to do it under various official banners. And the two that I want to start from are the human rights banner and the development goals banner. So human rights were the dominant language. We integrated the fight against poverty into the human rights conceptions, first in 1948, of course, with the Universal Declaration, and then subsequently with the covenants and with many other UN-sponsored human rights documents. Then, starting at the new millennium in the year 2000, the human rights language was pushed into the background, and a new language took over, the language of development goals. And I want to start off by saying a little bit about the significance of this shift in language. So here is what we find in the human rights documents. Universal Declaration, standard setting document 1948. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of oneself and of one's family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care. Everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. That is to say, everyone is entitled to a poverty-avoiding international order. The language of development goals is somewhat different. A typical example here, this is target 1.2 from the Sustainable Development Goals. By 2030, reduce at least by half the proportion living in poverty according to national definitions. So what are the important differences here? I think the most important differences are three. The first one is quite obvious. When you talk about human rights, you talk about highest priority claims. Human rights are not something that's easily negotiable, that can be set aside for policy priorities, but rather it's something that is a side constraint, as some people like to say. It's something that we absolutely have to honor, whatever else we might want to do. Not so with goals. Goals are goals among many. There are many, many other things that policymakers are aiming for. And so goals get put into the usual mix of policy and get whatever priority policymakers might want to give them. It's perfectly all right to say that we didn't get around to this goal because we had many other goals to pursue and so on. Second, there is the difference between individualist versus collectivist language. The easiest way to illustrate that is to think of somebody who makes a claim, who says, look, I'm very poor, I'm hungry, I don't have the minimum for a reasonable life for myself and my family. If you make that claim under a human rights banner, then it's a claim that cannot be refused. If the resources are there, if we can do something to fulfill the human rights of that person, then she or he has a very strong claim that we do exactly that. Not so with the development goals, right? We are supposed to reduce by half the proportion living in poverty by 2030. That's a 15-year period from 2015 to 2030. So each year we have to reduce this proportion by 4.5%. Given population growth, that means the number of poor people has to go down by 3.5% every year. And we can just say to such a person, sorry, mate, we have already achieved our 3.5% for this year. Why don't you come back next year? We are on track, we are on target, we are doing all that we have committed ourselves to do. So in other words, the claim of any one person can be turned back by saying that we have already done enough for other people. And finally, there is a way of measuring ourselves, our achievement. When we think about human rights, we will always find that we are in shortfall. Insofar as human rights are unavoidably unachieved, we are falling short of where we should be. The benchmark is always a benchmark above us, and our state is described in negative terms. We are falling short by so and so much from where we should be, namely in a world where all unavoidable human rights deficits are actually avoided. With the development goals, it's a little different. We can spin it in a positive way. We start the goals at the point at which they are declared, in this case 2015, and we say, well, how far did we come? How much of the distance between the 2015 state of affairs and the 2030 target state, how much of that distance have we already traversed? So we can spin it positively and present it as progress. And a wonderful place to see that is Bill Gates. Bill Gates has a big foundation, as you know, with billions and billions of dollars, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And Warren Buffett, who at that time was the second richest man on earth after Bill Gates, saw fit to give a further several $10 billion of his money to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And then he wrote them a letter saying, would you be kind enough to tell us a little bit, about what you have achieved with that money? How is it going with your fight against poverty? So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation issues a rather personal letter every year. This is the 2017 letter, where they talk about the progress that we have made. And here, this is what they call our favorite number. 122 million children's lives have been saved since 1990. And basically through a reduction in child mortality. These are children under the age of 5. Here you can see, this is a little bit further down in the same letter, they quote a diagram from The Economist magazine, where you can see the descending graph of fewer and fewer children dying every year. And how did we save 122 million children? Well, this is how we did it. If you take the number of deaths of children in the year 1990 and extend that number, then you see the triangle above the curve shows you all the child deaths that did not happen. So we saved all these children that didn't die and would have died if child deaths had continued. The number turns out to be 86.5 million, but let's not be stingy, 122, that's fine. But still, we should think a little bit about the mathematics involved here, right? One thing that is immediately obvious is that given general growth in the world economy is growing, so it's pretty automatic that poverty is shrinking. As incomes around the world rise, there will be fewer and fewer people living below any arbitrary poverty line, however you may want to specify it. And so when the number of poor people goes down or the number of dying children goes down, that doesn't mean that anybody necessarily did anything to make it go down. It's not necessarily an achievement of us, as Bill and Melinda Gates put it. We have achieved, we have reduced poverty. It could just be an effect of ordinary growth. And that's what every sane person would say if you talk, for example, about China, right? You can say that, yeah, China had a fantastic poverty reduction over the same 30-year period, 1990 to today, whatever. And that poverty reduction is a result or a byproduct of the economic growth that China has experienced. And sure, you can say that it was achieved in some way, maybe by the people of China who had a high savings rate and worked very hard. The government didn't exactly stand in the way. They were quite happy to have that growth. But to say that this is an achievement of a poverty fighting effort is maybe a little bit rich. So there is the danger that the Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development Goals, it's basically politicians making a prediction with ordinary economic growth, where will we be by 2030? And then when 2030 rolls along, they say, wow, we achieved it, without really having done anything more than witnessed a period of economic growth. Now, central to the development goals are statistics about income, which are kept by the World Bank, and statistics about undernourishment, also known as hunger, which are kept by 5 organizations: the FAO, IFAD, UNICEF, the World Food Programme, and the World Health Organization. They do that together. So those are the most prominent statistics. They go a little bit beyond the Gates reference to the dying children. And what you're probably familiar with is this wonderful language of lifting people out of poverty. How many people we are lifting out of poverty. And again, the same methodology is used. You basically say how many people were poor in 1990, how many people are poor now, and the difference between those two are the people that we lifted out of poverty. And again, my response would be that a lot of that is probably just a byproduct of ordinary economic growth. But anyway, here you can see it in the Bill and Melinda Gates letter. We have lifted people out of poverty. Poverty has gone down from around 1.8 billion, you see it here, in 1990 to somewhere around 500 million or less in 2020. And it's getting even better towards 2030 if present trends continue, which with the COVID-19 crisis upon us is not a foregone conclusion. Notice also these wonderfully happy 2 people who are running down the slope. Obviously, they are living a very good life now and are no longer poor. But notice also what is written into the curve. People living on $1.25 or less a day. This is the definition of poverty that the World Bank is working with. So the World Bank initially started out defining poverty in terms of $1 a person. The older ones among you will remember $1 a day per person. This was 1985 currency. Then they changed it to $1.08 per person in 1993 currency, $1.25 per person in 2005 currency, and finally $1.90 per person in 2011 currency. Now, these are not exactly equivalent, but I spare you all the technical details. I just call your attention to how much money that really is. PPP here means purchasing power parities. So in the moment, with a $1.90 definition, we define as poor any household who per person per day has consumption expenditure that is less in terms of purchasing power than what you could buy with $1.90 in the United States in 2011. Today, by the way, that is $2.19 in October 2020, according to the CPI of the United States. That corresponds to $800 per person per year. So just stop for a moment and think about what it would be like if your consumption expenditure in the United States were $800 a year. What could you buy with $800 a year? How would you cope with such things as accommodation, with utilities, with food, with clothing? How would you meet your needs? The US Department of Agriculture helpfully publishes a thrifty food plan. You can go to their website and you get all sorts of tips about how to feed yourself as cheaply as possible. And you can probably do it with something in the order of $7 per person per day and get a fully nutritious set of meals. But that's only food. That's not everything else. And it's $7 and not $2.19. So it's completely impossible for $2.19 to have healthy, nutritious food in the United States, let alone to meet all the other needs that you have in addition to food. And don't think that $2.19 goes a lot farther in India or in Africa. Of course it does, but the World Bank already takes that into account. They are not converting according to foreign exchange rates that you might get at the bank, but they are converting according to purchasing power parities, which take account of the different differential purchasing power of currencies around the world. So the thought experiment you have to make strictly is, how would I cope with on $2.19 per person per day in the United States today? This is a very, very low poverty line. And to depict these beautiful people running down the slope and dancing happily on that amount of money is really a little bit far-fetched. And it's especially far-fetched coming from the Gates folks who have rather more money. And for them to tell poor people, you know, this is really an adequate amount of money for you to live on is a little rich. Now, here are the official statistics from the World Bank. You can see that indeed, as Gates is claiming, we are down to somewhere around 600 million people. The South Asia numbers they have now taken out because they don't have enough survey data. But 600, 700 million people are officially counted as poor. Now, absolute poverty, according to the UN definition, refers to the income level below which a minimum diet and essential non-food requirements are not affordable, and reflects the inability of people to satisfy the basic needs required to live life with dignity. That's the UN definition, and relative to that definition, obviously the $1.90 line, or the poverty line of the World Bank, is woefully inadequate. If you just look at the statistics that you get officially from the various UN organizations, you can see here that of the 7.8 billion people in the world, very large numbers suffer from various kinds of deprivations. About 700 million are chronically undernourished, according to the FAO. I will get back to that statistic later. 2 billion lack access to essential medicines, 2.2 billion lack safe drinking water, 1.6 billion lack adequate shelter, 1 billion lack electricity, 2 billion lack adequate sanitation, more than 750 million people are illiterate, and about 150 million children do wage work outside their household, as Najid described earlier him doing when he was a child. So all these people, on any plausible definition, are poor. Of course, many of them overlap, so we can't just add the numbers, but we can certainly say that at least half the world's population suffer at least one of these deprivations, and so should be considered poor by a human rights standard or any other reasonable standard. So the World Bank, because of its ridiculously low poverty line, is grossly underestimating the number of poor people by any reasonable definition. Now let's also look at the trend. Bill Gates, this is a video where Bill Gates is interviewing Steven Pinker. They are together, two optimists, lamenting the fact that many people in the world do not know how good things really are. And so one thing that you find in that video, I've put the link on the top, is how hunger has declined. In 1990, there were about 18% of the world's population were suffering hunger, and now it's barely 1% left. Wow. Now here are the actual numbers from the FAO, and you can see that they are not quite as favorable, and they are certainly not quite as nicely falling as they should be. In fact, they are pretty flat, which is remarkable in view of the fact that the World Bank's poverty numbers are falling quite precipitously. One other thing that you see here is interesting. Compare the two orange lines. They are with the China revision and without the China revision. So in 2019, the Chinese government said that actually poverty in China, or hunger in China, is much less than it had been recorded. And so the FAO simply revised its hunger numbers for China down by a factor of 10. Instead of 130 million, there were only 12 million hungry people in China. That tells you a little bit about how political these numbers are. These are not sort of measured numbers. Obviously, if from one day to the next you can say, oops, we made a mistake of more than 1,000%, then you can see that maybe the way in which these numbers are developed isn't 100% reliable. Here is an earlier graph of the same facts, which are from the FAO, telling you how many undernourished people there are. And you can see that the numbers went up very steeply as a result of the global financial crisis. So we have 850 or fewer than 850 million, and then going above 1 billion. This happened in 2010, where the FAO in Rome, they had big character posters hanging out the windows saying, "We are mad as hell, more than 1 billion people hungry," for the first time in all of human history. This created a huge outcry on the part of the defenders of globalization. Many governments were deeply upset. The Economist magazine was deeply upset. The World Bank was deeply upset because they had been showing declining poverty numbers. And so, unsurprisingly, the FAO was forced to revise its numbers and its methodology. And the Economist magazine could then very gleefully proclaim that not a billion after all. The number of hungry people in the world is indeed a disgrace, but there was one problem with the precise figure. It was completely bogus. This week, in its 2012 report on the state of food insecurity in the world, the FAO quietly revised it down to 868 million and got rid of the spike in the numbers that had supposedly occurred in 2008 through 2010. So the Economist magazine was made very, very happy, but I do want to call your attention to the food riots, which we all remember. In at least 24 countries, there were major food riots because people could not feed their families. Here are the 24 countries. And what the Economist magazine wants to have us believe, and the World Bank and all the rest of the establishment, is that this never happened. These people were mistaken. They rioted, perhaps, we won't deny that, but they weren't really hungry. They thought they were hungry. They thought they didn't have enough food. But really, there was no spike in hunger. There was no spike in poverty. Everything went well. Our globalization project went along smoothly and without a problem. Now, what did the FAO have to do in order to get to the much more benign food unavailability numbers that they finally developed? How did they change their methodology in 2012 to convert a rising curve of hunger into a falling curve? Well, here is the methodology as they themselves explain it in their 2012 State of Food Insecurity report. This is the small print on page 50, where they explain who counts as hungry. So here, what you can see is that they base their measurement on dietary energy intake, and they define undernourishment as an extreme form of food insecurity that arises when food energy availability is inadequate to cover even minimum needs for a sedentary lifestyle. So let's pick that apart for a moment. You count as undernourished if you fulfill all four of the following four conditions. First of all, we are looking only at the food that people ingest. We are ignoring absorption problems. Many people in developing countries have problems absorbing the food they ingest because of parasites, for example, most commonly. And so the right number of calories may be crossing their lips, but they don't get the value of these calories because they have other creatures eating part of their meal, so to speak. Secondly, the FAO's definition looks only at energy. It ignores all other nutrient deficiencies, so vitamins, minerals, proteins, everything that is important to a rich diet is completely ignored. The only question they ask is, do you ingest enough energy? To put this colorfully, Coca-Cola will do it, unless you have the 0-calorie type. But if you have the sugary Coca-Cola, you are well nourished if you drink a few cans of those every day. Then they talk about the right number of calories to cover the minimum needs for a sedentary lifestyle. Only if you cannot cover even those minimum needs, only then do you count as undernourished. Again, that's insane because many people work for a living, and in developing countries, they often work very hard for a living. They expend not just the usual 1,800 calories or kilocalories that I might expend, but maybe 5,000 if they are rickshaw drivers or construction workers or even housewives fetching water from the river, this is hard work and it requires a lot of calories. It's not just a hobby or exercise. So many people could be undernourished even while they get the 1800 kilocalories. And then they also add that you count as undernourished only if you are below that 1800 threshold for over a year. If it's less than a year, if you are hungry for 11 months, you're not hungry. It just doesn't count. It's not in the statistic. And you ask yourself, what? Why not? Well, they have an answer for you. Here's the answer. The reference period should be long enough for the consequences of low food intake to be detrimental to health. Although there is no doubt that temporary food shortage may be stressful, the FAO indicator is based on a full year. Again, you ask yourself, how is that possible? This is the UN agency that is in charge of food for the world, and they must know that any normal human being is dead after 40 days of getting no food. So how can they say that this may be stressful but isn't detrimental to health? This is completely off the wall. This is not just sort of arguable, but this is in the Trump region of implausible. So how is it that the FAO experts, obviously experts, adopt such a completely crazy methodology to deliberately undercount the undernourished people in the world? Well, it's political pressure. The World Bank was unhappy with the FAO numbers. Governments were unhappy. They wanted their globalization project vindicated. And the incidence and trend data are highly politicized. It's very important for the debate about globalization, for the success of the Washington Consensus. It's very important that we be able to say things are getting better all the time. They're getting massively better. We have lifted millions of people out of poverty. We have saved tens of millions of children from a premature death and so on. So what that means is that if we want to have accurate data of what really goes on with poverty in the world, we cannot leave the data collection and data processing to international agencies, because these agencies depend both for their leadership and for their budgets on the very governments whose success is being monitored by these data. So let's talk a little about the assessment of persistent poverty. We have seen here that progress against poverty has been much less impressive than officially celebrated. The official data are unreliable, to put it mildly. But we should also, as I have, ask whether the MDG SDG language suggests the past provides the morally appropriate baseline. I think that, to remind you of it, we should, when we think about poverty, we should compare the state of the world as it is, not with the state of a previous time where things might have been even worse, but we should compare it with what could now be. We should always ask ourselves how much of the poverty that exists today is today unavoidable. And that gets me to the topic of explanation. So when we think about avoidability of poverty, we have to ask ourselves, how could our world be different? How could we change the world, reform the world in such a way that we would have a lot less poverty? And I will conclude with a few remarks on how much of the poverty that we have today might indeed be unavoidable. I think a very important factor that explains the persistence of poverty is institutions, institutional arrangements at the supranational, regional, and national level. And of course, these institutions are designed under the heavy influence of the most advantaged, most privileged, richest people in the world. These people, as they keep emphasizing, do not hate the poor. To the contrary, they like the poor and they wish them well, but they like themselves even more. And of course, they do what they can to get as large a share of the global product into their own pockets. And it's a regrettable but entirely predictable side effect of these efforts that there isn't so much left for the poor. You can see here an example. I have no time to go through that, but important institutional arrangements at the global level that play an important role in the persistence of poverty. Protectionism, pollution rules, that we don't have polluters pay for the damage that they do, illicit financial flows, a huge network of tax havens and shell companies that siphons off money, avoids taxes, and is available for bribing and otherwise inducing politicians to design the rules in favor of the rich. Pharmaceuticals is one big example of intellectual property rights, which are a huge flow of money from the poor countries to the rich. Everybody has to pay for the innovations that, of course, rich people are in a much better position to achieve. Labor standards completely missing, exploitability of workforces in developing countries. So institutions play a major role. Again, I cannot go through this now, but I leave you with a few statistics about the size of the poverty problem. It is much larger than most of us think in human terms. More than half of all human beings suffer one or more poverty-related human rights deficits. But it's also much smaller than most people think in economic terms. If we shifted just 3% of the wealth of the richest 1% of human beings, that would be $5.2 trillion, or 34 times the annual official development assistance, and could very easily wipe out poverty worldwide. So the world has become rich enough in aggregate that we could, at virtually no noticeable effect on anybody, get rid of poverty. Poverty is a very small problem in economic terms, and that, of course, makes it, from a moral point of view, even much more horrendous that we allow it to persist at the level as it does persist, affecting about half of all human beings. You can see here the global income distribution. The richest 5% have about 43% of global income. The poorest half have about 4.5%, 1/10 as much. So again, by shifting 1/10 of the income of the richest quarter, you could double the incomes in the bottom half. And with wealth, the differences are even more dramatic. The richest 26 individuals in the world have the same wealth as the poorest 50%. So you could, again, very easily, at no noticeable cost to anybody, double, triple, quadruple the wealth of the poorest people in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Every time I hear this, I've heard some of it, or maybe most of it, many times, have read it, have encountered these numbers and these thoughts. I'm always struck by how quietly you wave your hands, how basically pulling our hair out is done by you so forcefully, because you're not screaming and pulling your hair out. I always wonder also at the divide we make between giving the facts and then assessing them, and not just assessing them, but of course, judging ethically what is going on here. You did at the end hint at where we could go, but I keep thinking of the last question that was asked of Eva: what should we do? What can we do? And I always want to ask you who it is that can or should somehow bring to bear your recommendations or your suggestions or your advice. Yes, 26 people have as much as the bottom half of the world, but how do we get that money to travel? Is this a matter of, again, policymakers? Is it governmental decisions? Is it the world standing up? Is it academics writing articles and analyzing the concepts as you have? So I'm just telling you of all the thoughts that go through my head when you present this information. I'm looking for a moment to see if we have any questions yet.
Yeah, maybe I just begin with what you just asked and what was asked of Eva.
Yeah, it's a deep, I'm not saying it's a deep question. I'm saying it's a deep disquiet that I have when I hear these things or when I read these things. So yes, it is a question in that sense. Thanks.
Yeah, so the thing is, one thing that strikes me as difficult to do is to actually shift the global income distribution. There's a lot of resistance, right? So for example, if you want to create something, I once proposed something called a global resources dividend, which would have slightly reduced the income of the richest people in the world and slightly increased the income, dramatically for them, the income of the poor. It would have shifted a very small slice of annual income from the rich to the poor. No go. Nobody's interested in that. Everybody kind of says it's a nice idea. And of course, the poor should be helped, but politically totally unfeasible. I then put a lot of support behind the Health Impact Fund. And I think the Health Impact Fund has this wonderful feature. It wouldn't cost anybody anything, because the current system of incentivizing pharmaceutical innovation is so incredibly inefficient that by just wringing out the waste, you can, without anybody losing money, greatly improve the position of the global poor. The pharmaceutical companies would earn just as much as before, but they would allow poor people to participate in the fruits of innovation, and they would also do a few additional innovations that are relevant to the poor in particular, namely the neglected diseases of poverty, diseases like hepatitis, tuberculosis, malaria, HIV/AIDS, pneumonia, that get very little research attention now, but would get a lot more if the Health Impact Fund were instituted. The Health Impact Fund would cost a few $1 billion a year, and that money would come back in through cheaper medicines, through lower bills for hospitalization, so it wouldn't cost anybody anything. But even that is very difficult to institute, and it's an extremely small amount. It's an amount that in the end wouldn't cost anybody anything, because it would come out again through the benefits of the Health Impact Fund. So it is a monumental indifference on the part of policymakers and a large part of the general public that makes it very difficult to achieve reform projects, even reform projects as obvious as the Health Impact Fund. I hope that now with COVID-19, there is a chance that we can get at least a pilot going, but we have to see.
Well, your mention of COVID brings up another question, but first I'd like to present Gabriel Amitzi's question, which is really in continuation of your previous answer, saying, is it time to put forward a global strategy in favor of adopting international binding anti-poverty law? And here, what I think of as the main terms here, there's global strategy. So what is a global strategy? Who decides on a global strategy? Who then does things? You did say policymakers before, we have governments, but here what they're talking about is international binding anti-poverty law. So we are talking here about the international law, the legal system, and we would have to somehow make that well, I don't know if we could, yeah, well, you've written actually about that, about who it is that can make sure that international law is abided by. So this is international binding. Every single word here is a question for me. Global, strategy, adopt, and binding. And then we've got the international anti-poverty law. That would be the law that we want to somehow formulate and make legally binding. I wonder, and the question was, is it time to put this forth? But I would add to that, even if it is time, what do we do?
Well, if you ask me, I would say we have it, right? We have human rights law, which says that people have a human right not to be poor. We have a clear instruction for the interpretation of these human rights in Article 28 of the Universal Declaration, which I cited in this lecture. Everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. So in a sense, if we had appropriate enforcement, we could bring a case. Poor people could bring a case and say, under international law, the institutions that are currently being enforced in the world, the way the world economy is structured, are violating international human rights law by avoidably keeping us in poverty. Now, the question is, which court would take such a case? Where could you bring such a case? I don't think that, I think it's already on the books. It would, of course, be nice if one had it on the books in a more specific, more clear-cut way. But I think in principle, we have it in international law already. Right? What we need is to think about the institutions that we have. For example, the TRIPS agreement, international property rights, or other aspects of our international economic order, to think about them explicitly in human rights terms. And that's why I think it's so highly regrettable that the language of human rights was taken out of the social and economic discourse. So there was a big movement in the 1990s, which I was a part of, saying we need to sort of think about what the social and economic human rights really mean, and we need to work them into the discussion about institutional arrangements, in particular arrangements of the world economy. And that discussion was apparently perceived as dangerous by people in governments, and they shut that down by switching attention to the MDGs and the SDGs, basically saying, no, let's not talk about human rights anymore. That's not a good approach. Let's talk about goals, and let's set some targets and goals, ideally ones that we don't need to do anything to achieve, that are essentially self-achieving through ordinary economic growth.
But you're talking about language, and I find that fascinating as well. The way we talk about these things, do we talk in human rights language? Do we talk in development terms? And I was thinking, as you were talking about the concept of peace, which you'd think has nothing to do with this, but of course it's the World Food Program that got the Nobel Peace Prize this year. And I remember when that happened, I thought, well, the Nobel people have forever been going the human rights angle. They do think of human rights or human rights workers or fighters for human rights as peace fighters, which is interesting how peace and human rights just got smudged in together. It doesn't matter what you're really talking about. But the World Food Program that got the the Peace Prize is, of course, closely connected. I think one is a part of the other with the FAO that you were talking about. The FAO is I think they're a part of the World Food Program.
Well, they are together. These 5 organizations are authoring the State of Food Insecurity reports. So now they are collectively responsible for this.
Okay.
But here's the paradox, right? These are people, these are good people. These are people, first of all, they're experts. They know what they're doing. So it's not that they're stupid. And secondly, they're really trying to do a good job. They're trying to do something for reducing undernourishment in the world. And so they say to themselves, very realistically, if we displease governments, then we get shut down, right? Our budgets will be cut. We will get, our leaders will be replaced. So if the governments want to see good-looking undernourishment trends, good-looking poverty trends, we better deliver them if we want to do our work. That's the only explanation I can see. I discussed with the chief statistician of the FAO these matters, and I mean, I cannot believe that he understands the points that I'm making. It's not that this is rocket science or that I, as a philosopher, am somehow privy to insights that experts don't have. Not at all, right? It is a political thing, and that's why we academics, I think, have an immense responsibility to check these numbers, to work on these numbers and say, look, here is a country that we pick, India, whatever it may be, and we do a double check and see how many people really are undernourished in India. This is what the FAO says, this is the real data, and so on. So that we keep them honest and keep pressure on them and give them cover, so that then they say to the politicians, look, we can't say that because it's just blatantly untrue. Or if we were to say that, we would be laughed out of any academic conference. That they have some backing for that, right? We should not, as academics, simply be consumers of these numbers and say, well, if that's what the official number of undernourished people is, then we will just cite that and treat it as if it were a weather report from John F. Kennedy Airport.
So I want to take you back for a moment then. You said political and academic. Academic is what we have to do, and then there's the politics. But Gabriel comes back with the same question, not the same question, with a continuing question, talking about the UN conventions, talking about international law, and saying, how do you get enforceable rights? Who is it that's going to enforce it? And the suggestion, Gabriel's suggestion, is what about a new UN convention? And I know there are people I know in India working on UN convention, a new UN, the UDHR, getting the UDHR updated or something. But I, again, am more worried about the word enforceable. And you have taken us the political way in talking about enforceable, saying that there's something here that's not a matter for legalisms or international police, maybe not even international courts, but something, well, yeah, courts would be enforcing these rights, enforcing the laws, international laws that we're talking about. I know this sort of meshes everything together, the political, the academic, and the legal aspects of these questions. You do have them very clearly spelled out in your presentation, but I think it is when we get down to the ground, as you say, if we go to some conference and give the wrong data, somebody's going to jump up and say this is wrong or this is right. But Gabriel is insisting here that the UN might have some sort of enforceable job or role to play here.
Yeah, it would be fantastic if we had it, right? So something interesting is happening right now, where Gabon, a country in Africa, is taking Myanmar to the International Criminal Court.
Yeah.
And that's a big event. Myanmar had committed a genocide against the Rohingya, and Gabon is saying, I want that at the International Criminal Court, I want this to be examined. Wow. And if we could do something like that, if we could bring a case to the International Criminal Court and say, here is a massive human rights violation, millions of people would have access to this anti-hepatitis drug if Indian companies were permitted to produce it, Indian generic manufacturers, they could produce it for pennies, and then all the people in India, all the people in the global south would have access to this drug. So by maintaining an intellectual property regime that prevents Indian generic companies from mass producing this product, we are killing millions and millions of people. And so the TRIPS agreement is itself a violation of human rights.
Mhm.
If you could bring such a case, I think it would be absolutely fantastic.
Well, that is true, and I'm happy that you mentioned Gabon. It takes me back to Albert Schweitzer, of course,
Right.
and Lamborghini and the hospital there. I think we're exactly at 12 p.m. now, which is the hour that we are slated to end this session. I do want to thank everyone, the questioners, especially Eva Iluz, Thomas Pogge, for telling us such sad tales, actually. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Thomas.